Hello everyone, welcome to this case study on the detection of sarcopenic obesity using bioimpedance analysis. Before I start showing you how this type of pathology can be detected using bioimpedance analysis, I would like to remind you what sarcopenic obesity is, AUG, and particularly R, obesity, because recently, in the January 2025, a new consensus was proposed for obesity, actually defining it as either clinical or preclinical obesity, with obesity being defined as a body mass index greater than 30 kilograms per square meter, associated with an excess of fat mass and one or more organ dysfunctions caused by this excess fat mass. This, notably, includes metabolic alterations such as type 2 diabetes, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular complications, or musculoskeletal disorders, including muscle dysfunction. And based on this definition, it is recommended that obesity be truly considered a pathology, and that its management involves both medication and, of particular interest to us, lifestyle modifications through physical activity and nutrition. And for physical activity, today we truly consider exercise as a form of medication. And to understand how it can quickly improve health, it is important to understand that it is based on the principle of necessary overcompensation. That is to say, through physical activity, we induce a physiological stress to which the body will adapt physiologically in order to try to limit the effects of this stress when we engage in, say, this physical activity. For example, aerobic physical activity, which includes all endurance activities like walking, low-intensity cycling, or even much more intense activities, will promote a metabolic stress that encourages mitochondrial genesis and thus increases the number of mitochondria within your muscles and throughout the body. And in fact, this principle can really be adjusted depending on the type of exercise, the intensity, or the amount of physical activity. And the main engine of the body at that moment is the muscle. And to effectively target physical activity, it is useful to know these different modalities and their effects on health. So the main driver of physical activity remains the muscle. However, often when we think of muscle, we think of sports, but muscles are also used, for example, to climb stairs, carry groceries, or cook. And very often, when there is sarcopenia or muscle dysfunction, this muscle will function much less effectively. Either its mass will be insufficient, so the force it produces will be inadequate, but also there will be an exacerbation of muscle fatigue, meaning the muscle's reduced ability to produce force, which will be induced by exercise and reversible by rest. And so, in fact, this deterioration in resistance to fatigue, which can be equated to muscle endurance over time, will have a real impact on the overall fatigue of patients. Quite simply because, as you can see on this graph, if we take an exercise that induces a given physiological load in someone who does not have this decrease in muscle endurance, it will cause little fatigue and a quick recovery. However, if you see that there is a decrease in muscle endurance, you will experience much greater fatigue with a much longer recovery time. Except that our everyday life is not an isolated exercise. It's a repetition of many exercises. You can see on this graph that if we repeat these exercises, people do not have time to recover between each of these small daily activities, and thus they will accumulate fatigue over time due to this decrease in muscle endurance. And so at that point, the decrease in strength and endurance will truly lead to a progressive decline in individuals' ability to perform daily life activities. And this is really something that we find in the condition called sarcopenia, and this sarcopenia, how it will really also lower all the quality, everything related to quality of life and treatment effectiveness. As we have seen previously, a decrease in functional capacity, which will lead to difficulty in performing daily life activities, whether it's shopping, walking, being with loved ones, potentially engaging in physical and sports activities with loved ones. And at that point, this difficulty can lead to anxiety and depression, which will, in fact, further worsen sarcopenia and malnutrition, because previously there will be a tendency to have dietary intake that is also much less qualitative, and thus they will decrease muscle mass, which will increase the difficulty in performing daily activities, hence anxiety and depression. And you see that we will enter a vicious cycle that will ultimately create a state of frailty. And so it is really important to prevent or effectively manage this sarcopenia to avoid the establishment of vicious cycles. The problem is that I told you that sarcopenia is a decrease in strength and muscle mass, and we arrive at a paradox, which is that people with obesity have high muscle mass, yet they exhibit phenotypes similar to patients with sarcopenia. And so, we will talk about sarcopenic obesity, but it's mainly about how we will be detected, how we will define it. Here, to see how we can detect it, we will take the example of a 48-year-old man who is 1.72 meters tall and weighs 99.6 kilograms, which gives a BMI of about 33.7 kilograms. You can see here that he indeed has a very high body fat percentage of 101, compared to the references, which is over 14 kilograms more, and also a greater muscle mass of 4.7 kilograms compared to the reference. However, this man is indeed in sarcopenic obesity. We can also see that in terms of BMI, if we divide it between a fat mass index and a non-fat mass index, we can see that in fact he has a fat mass much higher than 95% of men his age, but his non-fat mass is barely higher than 95% of men his age. And so, he still has a very high muscle mass compared to the population. However, in fact, if we look at a parameter that is very interesting in this case, the muscle mass to weight ratio, well, we can see that it is below the limit set by ESPEN, the European Society for Clinical Nutrition, and ESO, the European Society on Obesity, and thus, this person is indeed in sarcopenic obesity. And in fact, why is she in sarcopenic obesity? It's because, in fact, her skeletal muscle mass is insufficient in relation to her body weight. And so at that point, actually, the intensity of daily life activities will be high for these people, for this person, which will increase the physiological load and thus the patient's fatigue over time. This means that really you have to think that for this person, for example, walking is the same physiological intensity as if you were jogging, and so it will create much, much, much more fatigue. And as we showed earlier, according to the vicious circle, they will tend to do less and less physical activity precisely to avoid this fatigue. And so here we can really think about some approaches to management in relation to lifestyle, particularly weight training and muscle strengthening, which will be useful for maintaining or increasing muscle mass. This can particularly facilitate getting back into movement while minimizing the unpleasant sensations related to exercise that can really hinder people who are obese, especially those with sarcopenic obesity, and aerobic physical activity, generally referred to as endurance, which will allow both an improvement in energy metabolism while having a protective effect on the cardiovascular system. And it is really very interesting from an exercise perspective to combine these two methods, for example, by mixing strength training with walking, cycling, or swimming, if people feel ready to swim. It is also necessary that there is an increase in protein intake, which will allow for the maintenance and or gain of muscle mass during the management generally, greater than 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, and a balanced diet, allowing for a caloric deficit that will lead to fat mass loss while ensuring normal metabolic function. And so, as I mentioned earlier, in conclusion, sarcopenic obesity is really defined as insufficient skeletal muscle mass relative to body weight, with ESPEN and ESO recommending the use of the muscle mass to weight ratio with a threshold of 37% for men and 27.6% for women, which you can find in the summary tile, and that an approach involving resistance physical activity combined with a protein-rich diet can help increase and/or maintain muscle mass while allowing for fat mass loss.